Donald Trump declared war, not on the battlefield, but in the Caribbean Sea against both Venezuela and Cuba. Moreover, at the United States State Department, they're even mocking Russia about this, saying that the United States is attacking two of Moscow's allies at once, and Putin can't do anything about it. American destroyers have started a real hunt for tankers of the Shadow Fleet, and ships are being seized and their cargoes arrested. And the dictators in Caracas and Havana are frantically calling Moscow, but in Moscow they reply that they are very concerned but can't help in any way. What's the point? Venezuelan oil no longer reaches Cuba. In this way, the United States kills two birds with one stone. Because without Venezuelan oil, Cuba won't survive, and Nicolas Maduro's regime in Venezuela won't survive without Cuba's support. I'll explain everything in this episode right now. The so-called Island of Freedom is on the verge of a hunger riot and a total blackout. So in this episode, we'll discuss why Marco Rubio calls this operation killing two birds with one stone. And all this is the persecution of Venezuela's oil tankers. How will the collapse of Cuba's economy affect Putin's military ambitions, and why? Could this naval battle in the tropics also become a turning point in Russia's war against Ukraine? My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and leave any comment under this video. This really helps promote the episodes on YouTube, and subscribe to my Telegram channel Pichi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. Let's begin with the facts published today by Bloomberg, The Wall Street Journal, and other United States media. A Hollywood action movie plot is playing out in the Caribbean. The United States Coast Guard and Navy have received a direct order from Donald Trump to stop, inspect, and detain any vessels suspected of transporting sanctioned oil. And these are not just threats, this is already action. It all started on December 10th when the supertanker Skipper was intercepted. Just for a moment, its length is 330 meters. Just imagine that giant. And so, according to KPLER analysts, this tanker turned off its transponders, that is, its tracking system, and secretly loaded 1.1 million barrels of oil in Venezuela. And it was already leaving, but it was intercepted. This tanker is already a repeat offender because it previously transported Iranian oil, but this time it was supposed to deliver a shipment of oil from Venezuela to Cuba, but it never made it there. But, as it turned out, that was only the beginning. This Saturday, American military forces boarded the ship Centuris, and on Sunday they announced a pursuit of the tanker Bella 1, which is also under sanctions. 3 tankers departing Venezuela were intercepted and their cargo seized. What's happening? Trump is following the strategy discussed by United States State Department head Marco Rubio. Earlier this year, Rubio was convincing Donald Trump that if they started an operation against Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, they could kill 2 birds with one stone. Communist Cuba is highly dependent on Venezuelan oil, and Nicolas Maduro's regime in Venezuela is generously supported by the authorities in Cuba. In other words, they are highly dependent on each other. If you take out one player in this chain, both will collapse. So, essentially, Washington is cutting off the artery that feeds the 2 main anti-American regimes in this region, and they're doing it by force. This is a type of naval blockade not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s. Why is this deadly dangerous for the allies of dictator Vladimir Putin? The thing is, Cuba's economy is like a zombie that survives only thanks to Venezuela's oil lifeline. Since 1999, Hugo Chavez began saving his communist brothers by sending them 100,000 barrels of oil a day almost for free, basically for pennies. In return, Havana sent doctors to Venezuela and, more importantly, intelligence agents who are helping Nicolas Maduro stay in power today. So does the political support come specifically from Cuba? But now, sorry, the free ride is over, supplies have dropped to 30,000 barrels, and now, because of Trump's crackdown on tankers, they could drop to 0. And what does that mean? It means that Cuba is left completely without fuel. Cuba has minimal domestic production. But you understand that they can't cover all their needs, since they used to get 100,000 barrels a day from Venezuela. Here, the Wall Street Journal shares some alarming statistics today. The Cuban economy is facing collapse, there's no doubt about it. The country is going through its worst crisis since 1959. The numbers are simply shocking. Since 2020, 2.7 million people have left the island. That's a quarter of the entire population. Once again, almost 3 million people have left there in 5 years they've fled. That's like if 10 million people left Ukraine. In other words, that's a huge number. 90% of Cubans live in extreme poverty, and 70% can't even have a proper meal once a day. There's no electricity for 18 hours a day, and now there won't even be oil from Venezuela anymore. That's why demographer Carlos Albizu Campas calls this demographic devastation and a humanitarian catastrophe on the scale of war. And now just imagine, on top of all this hell, a complete halt of supplies is added. A tanker with 1 million barrels, which was intercepted by the Americans, was carrying light and life for Cuba's power plants, and now that light simply won't be there. Well, I mean, if oil supplies stop and everything is heading that way, the situation will just become unbearable. Consider that this is another figure from the Wall Street Journal. Inflation in Cuba is at 450, it's just a collapse. You might ask, why should we care about Cuba? Let them return to the Stone Age. It doesn't matter to us. The thing is, Cuba and Venezuela aren't just distant resorts, they're Russia's rear base. First, that's exactly where Putin is recruiting mercenaries for the war in Ukraine. The Wall Street Journal writes, desperate to earn a living, some Cubans fell for Putin's propaganda and went to Russia to fight for money against Ukraine. The worse things get on the island, the more cannon fodder goes to Donbass. If the regime falls, the mercenary flow will shift. Secondly, Russia invested billions of dollars to support Nicolas Maduro and the Cuban communists in order to have military bases and intelligence centers right next to the United States. Trump is now hitting these investments, and if Cuba collapses, Putin will either have to urgently send money and oil there, which he doesn't have much of himself because of the war against Ukraine, or lose his influence. Cuba and Venezuela are both being taken out at once across the Western Hemisphere. This will be a long struggle, but nevertheless, every dollar the Kremlin spends on saving Maduro or Havana is a dollar that won't go toward producing missiles to strike Ukraine. So, the United States is basically stretching Russia's resources by creating a crisis for it on the other side of the world. And it's interesting because just the other day Marco Rubio was asked in an interview, "What do you think about this?" Over there, Sergei Lavrov, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, stated that we will definitely respond to what the Americans are doing with Venezuela. And Marco Rubio said, well, to paraphrase, "Do you really believe that the Russians can somehow influence the situation in Venezuela?" Other than expressing concern, jokingly he looks at the camera and says, "By the way, Sergei Lavrov, you're definitely going to watch this. Merry Christmas, my dear, but stay out of this. You don't belong here." So in the end, does the blockade in the Caribbean look like a signal to all of Russia's allies that basically you're next? And even though the United States is pursuing slightly different goals in the region, today they're stopping tankers headed for Cuba, and tomorrow they could cut off, for example, the shadow fleet of the Russian Federation in the Baltic. For example, when they're going to India, and by the way, yesterday Republican Senator Lindsey Graham already called on Trump to seize Russian oil tankers just like Venezuelan ones. Now, as they say, one leg of the Moscow-Tehran-Caracas global axis is being knocked out. The economic collapse of Cuba could provoke a revolution that would sweep Putin's friends, into the ocean. And that would be great news for Ukraine. So we continue to closely watch what is happening, seemingly in the distant Western Hemisphere. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. Friends, if you found this episode interesting or helpful, you can support the work of this YouTube channel with your donation or a paid subscription using the links and details provided. In the description of this video it clearly says support the channel Alexei Pechi. Choose any convenient format. I appreciate any support you provide. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.